You're listening to Managing Leadership Anxiety, Yours and Theirs, a show that discusses internal and relational anxiety, how it blocks effective leadership, and how we can move through it to a greater health. And now your host, Steve Cuss.
And we're in Season 2. Hey, last season we launched this podcast with the goal of helping bring relief to people by offering tools to help you notice and name what's happening under the surface in you and in those you lead. We also wanted to bring relief by interviewing guests and hearing from our guests both what makes them anxious, what they do when they don't know what to do, and how they manage their anxiety. And we had some fantastic guests in Season 1. And here in Season 2, we already have a full slate of guests booked. And just like last year, Brendan and I will hop on the microphones once in a while and dive deeper into a specific tool or a specific source of anxiety to hopefully help you out. And hey, before we go on, I have a favor to ask for everybody. I have a pretty small social media footprint, and if this podcast has helped you out, you could help us out by retweeting an episode or sharing it on Facebook or on Instagram, or by leaving an honest review on iTunes. And if you tag me, that would help us keep track of it too. I'm on Facebook under my name, Steve Cuss. Instagram and Twitter, I'm at Steve Cusswords. And I know a lot of podcasts ask you to do this, but the fact is it doesn't take long, and it actually makes a huge difference to help us reach more people who might benefit, especially podcasts that are just getting started like ours, with people who have a smaller social media footprint like me. So I really appreciate you taking a minute or so to help us out. Okay, I was 24 years old when I was first exposed to systems theory, also known as Bowen theory. When I served as a hospital chaplain, one of my supervisors was a systems guy. In fact, he actually studied under Murray Bowen, who was the founder of the whole thing. And his fellow classmate was Ed Friedman, for those of you who know that name. So I studied both of those guys, and then when I went to grad school, I went on to study cybernetics and second-order change. And we focused on how problems are formed and how problems are resolved, and how to figure out who's motivated to change and who isn't. And the whole thing was in the context of counseling theory, but I found it invaluable in leadership and even in parenting as well. So this season, Season 2, we'll dive a bit deeper into systems theory. A few months ago, I came across an article by Chuck Degroat on internal family systems theory. So I asked Chuck to come on my show, and he's our guest today here in Episode 1. Chuck's the professor of counseling and Christian spirituality at Western Theological Seminary in Holland, Michigan. He's also the co-founder and senior fellow at the Newbigin House of Studies in San Francisco. Chuck's an amazing guy. He's a counselor, a spiritual director. Chuck's a pastor and a professor and also an author. And he focuses most of his attention and work on the intersection of psychology, theology, and Christian spirituality. And he's just a fantastic resource for all of us. His most recent book is Wholeheartedness, where he dives into perfectionism and shame, and he's currently preparing a book on dealing with narcissists. So, yep, Chuck's a guy worth listening to, and I was grateful to sit down with him and talk about internal family systems. I started out by asking him to explain what exactly that is.
Yeah, so internal family systems is really fascinating. I came across it in, I want to say 2004, 2005. I was doing some adjunct work at a seminary down in Orlando, and I found a VCR tape with Richard Schwartz, the founder of Internal Family Systems. And, Schwartz introduces you and I to the complexity of the human soul, that we are both a true self. And he doesn't come at this from a sort of a Christian perspective, but he'd say there's a true self, there's a self that anchors us, and then there are selves around that self. There are parts of us that are develop as ways of coping with life. And so he says there are really like three sets of these selves. There are managers, there are exiles, and there are firefighters. And each one of these, and we could talk more about these three sets of parts within us, help us manage life in the midst of the brokenness and the woundedness and the pain and abuse and that we all experience.
Okay, yeah, that's great. So let's get into those three. You said it was managers, firefighters, and sorry, what was the third one?
Yeah, exiles.
Exiles, yeah. Would you mind saying a little bit about each of those?
Yeah, so What Schwartz was taking this from some theory that was out there uh, on sub-personalities. This idea that there are the simplest way of putting it is like this. I woke up this morning and there's a part of me that wanted to get up and get going for the day, and there's another part of me that just wanted to lay in bed forever.
Yeah.
So there are at least two parts of me this morning. But as we begin to identify these different parts of us that perhaps like to do one thing and another part resists it on the other side, we begin to realize that there are parts of us that are more managerial. They protect us from pain. They're the parts of us that anticipate a hard conversation and draw upon resistances within us. And so when I think about managerial kinds of parts, I think of I always tell the story of when I first got here to the seminary, and I'd been a pastor and a therapist. Now I'm on a seminary faculty with folks who graduated from Harvard and Princeton and Duke, and I don't have a PhD that is nearly that prestigious. And so for the first period of time, a humorous part of me kind of took over, and I would just be the funny guy in faculty meetings. And then for a little while there, I think a more kind of quiet, self-protective part of me took over, and I would just shut up. And I wouldn't say a thing because I was fearful of what they'd think if I opened my mouth. And then there was another part of me that thought, well, I could come up with something really brilliant. And so I'd save, a really brilliant line that I would deliver, at the right moment. These are just, this is kind of a simple way, maybe too simplistic way of talking about these parts of us that protect us. Now, what were they protecting me from? They were protecting me from shame. I didn't feel like I was quite enough. I didn't have the sense that I belonged on this prestigious faculty. And so they were protecting me from shame and anxiety. And those are exiles. When Schwartz talks about exiles, these are the parts of us that feel really young, that we're not prone to want to show to others or talk about very much. Maybe just to a few people, but we're not likely to talk about my most ashamed parts with someone that I meet on the street. Now, what Schwartz says is that when we're threatened, when our system is threatened in a significant kind of way, and there's a risk of profound shame, a firefighter will come into play, and a firefighter will douse the fire of vulnerability, of shame, of the risk of being exposed. And firefighters can look like parts of us that are addictive. And so I don't want to feel that. So I will drink too much, or I will abuse pornography, or so the firefighters are parts of us that really try to douse the flames of exposure, the fear of exposure, shame. And so those are the three main parts that IFS talks about.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. So obviously you have been sitting with this for 14 years now. Did you say 2004 was when you first?
4 or 5, yeah, right around there.
Yeah. And you've done doctoral level work on it. I feel like what you just laid out was just a great overview of what it is. For a leader that wants to dig in a little deeper in themselves, how do they begin to recognize one of these three inside them?
Yeah, that's a good question. When I started getting into this, I realized I could go on one or two paths. I'll talk about it a little bit more generally first, and I'll be a bit more specific. But I could educate myself and read all the books on internal family systems, or I could see a therapist. And I decided to see a therapist that had a specialization in internal family systems. And I would just generally recommend folks to do that kind of work. Now, the great thing is that with internal family systems, it's work that you can do on your own. And in fact, all you have to do is begin to ask yourself, well, what's going on inside of me right now? I love the question from Genesis chapter 3. Where are you? God goes looking for Adam and Eve, and they're in hiding, and God asks, where are you? And as I sit here right now, well, obviously I want to be present to you and to this conversation. but there's a part of me thinking about the sermon that I have to preach on Sunday morning. So there's a part of me that's thinking about that right now. There's a part of me that's a little bit anxious about a hard conversation that I need to have. There's a little part of me that's wrestling with anxiety about my daughter going to college next year and some of the anxiety she's having right now. So I'm here, but I might be in several different places right now. And that's always just a very simple way of beginning to identify the different parts of you that might be active and alive. And there are probably more parts to you that are not, just not quite as awake right now as others.
Okay, wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah, so one of the challenges is our listeners are all over the spectrum. Some people are this is the first time they've really started to pay attention to self.
Sure.
They're go, but others of our listeners, I would say, are quite far along in their awareness of anxiety or systems.
Right.
Could you just give us a tool or two when you start to notice, I guess, what you just described as like your divided self or your distracted self?
Yeah.
How do you begin to integrate back into wholeness in the moment?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's I always think that it's some sort of combination of awareness and intentionality. We've got to be aware enough to catch ourselves. And what I mean by catch ourselves is recognize that we're not in the present moment, that I'm not altogether here right now. And so none of us lives in the present moment 100% of the time, right? But it's when we find ourselves being pulled away from the present moment or distracted or anxious. So what I try to teach people and what I try to practice myself is to notice what's happening in your body, to notice your feelings, to notice particular triggers that rise up. And so, I might be very present in a conversation with my academic dean here at the seminary. And then he might say, well, I've got something kind of difficult that I need to share with you about a course evaluation, Chuck. And then, at that moment, any number of things can begin to happen. There might be some anxiety that wells up in me that I need to pay attention to. There might be some anger. There may be some resistance. I may want to run out of the room at that very moment. So at that point, I'm aware that a number of different parts of me were just triggered. And I think part of it is maybe a simple way of saying it is I like to imagine that these parts are in an inner living room within me. And it's like whispering to them, okay, I see you. I see you, anxious part of me. I see you, angry part of me. I see you, avoidant part of me, whatever you want to call them. I see you, and it's okay. And I'm here, and Jesus is here, and we'll be okay. And that's just a sort of a way of much like I talk to maybe one of my daughters who's feeling anxious. It's going to be okay. I'm right here. The interesting thing about internal family systems, and I found this to be true in my own work, is as you speak to these different parts of you, they tend to listen and relax. And so it's a combination of being aware and being intentional about engaging these different parts in the moment.
Okay, so I'm still early in my podcasting experience, and my producer is telling me you have to stop saying at the end, "That's so good," but that is so good. I feel like that's so helpful. So if I'm hearing you right, Chuck, you're saying that if you can learn to name the different parts of yourself and actually address them, like, so you even just inferred in your living room metaphor,
right?
You're actually pretty aware of the different parts of yourself that show up and what they are.
Yeah. So, I was flying out to Denver on Monday, and it was about a 2.5-hour flight from here, and I had some work to do, but then I had some downtime, and I just wanted to sort of be quiet, pay attention. And I noticed during that time that I started feeling a deep loneliness within me. And this is just sort of, I'm trying to say this for listeners who might not have any psychological education whatsoever, never read about this or not familiar at all.
Yeah, fantastic.
So then the question is, what do I do with that? I feel really lonely right now. Well, I could say, flight attendant, can you bring over a couple of bourbons? Um, or I can just pull out a book. Feels really uncomfortable. I'll just pull out a book and read and distract myself, or jump back on my laptop, or talk to the person next to me. Well, no, instead I decided to sit and just pay attention to this loneliness, and engage, in a sense, engage in a conversation with it, with this part of me. Now, that's probably sounds weird to some of your listeners, and I wouldn't expect that many would really understand at first what that feels like or looks like. But I just sort of said, "Well, tell me what you're feeling," and I won't tell you all about that conversation right now. I don't think everyone wants to hear about my loneliness, um, but I discovered that there was something going on within me that I maybe wasn't as familiar with even the day before. And then the question was, well, how do I hold this part of me and continue in conversation? Um, it's as simple as that. It's as simple as attentiveness to what's going on within you.
Great. Okay. So with internal family systems, the manager, the firefighter, the exile,
Right.
it's one thing to start to pay attention to who else is in the living room and how to name your own triggers. How important is it for a leader or someone who's interested in this to figure out when's the manager showing up, when's the exile showing up?
Yeah. Yeah. So once you get into this work and start doing it in earnest, that becomes pretty intuitive.
Okay.
Because you recognize that you don't even need the labels anymore. Really, you recognize that there are just these protective parts of yourself that keep you from feeling pain, keep you disconnected. By the way, that's not always bad, right? That can be really important for us, and is very important for us to sort of get through life. And so it's not a matter of judging these protective parts of you, just recognizing that they show up for a reason. And so when I'm in a conversation with my colleagues and like my academic part shows up, and I'm trying really, really hard to be smart, and thoughtful in the conversation, that I simply recognize that that's a protective part of me, and it's protect. So I don't need a label necessarily. I don't need to say, "Oh, manager, boom."
Yeah. Okay.
It's just pretty. But then I'm aware also that it's protecting me from that vulnerable feeling of being ashamed in front of my colleagues, feeling like I'm deficient, and so again, I don't need to necessarily label it exile, but I recognize that, oh wow, that is a very powerful feeling of really not being enough in the conversation right now, and that stings a little bit.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, it's almost like the three labels or categories are almost like a door to a new conduit.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, yeah. Like, so people who teach the Enneagram, I've heard them say, at first you get your Enneagram number, and even the stop sign has its own number. You see it everywhere. But over time, it starts to fade to the back of your mind. It sounds similar to this, where you start with these three categories. They're extremely helpful, but then eventually they're just providing an avenue for you to be able to name specifics.
That's it. Yeah. And I think what ends up happening is you're just aware that it's like mapping your internal world, and you have sort of this inner geography, right? And you begin to have put names to the different ways that you cope. And as you do this kind of work, you're growing in self-awareness, and I think for me, it's like you're less apt to fall back into those patterns next time. And so even as I show up for a faculty meeting now 5 years later, I'm aware of what's going on inside. I'm less apt to be the funny guy or the academic guy or the avoidant guy, but just simply to be present and maybe even risk. I think wholeness, in a sense, is bringing all these different parts of you to the table. And so I can bring something academic, or I can make a joke, but it's not out of a self-protective place.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. It's not that you now show up as a dullard. You're still
right.
Yeah, you're still witty and sharp, but it's
right.
Coming from a more true place, I think, is what you're saying.
That's right.
Yeah, and I'm guessing you're also suggesting it's never purely a true place or purely your false self.
Yeah, right. And this is where it's I think if you get in your head too much about this stuff, you're gonna you're just going to be burdened by all sorts of self-judgment and anxiety. Am I in my false self right now? Am I in my true self?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, no, we have to recognize that we're all always kind of in that mix, and it's okay.
I would like to hear a word from you on that, Chuck. I found in the materials that I teach, I tend to be pretty quick to forgive myself. It's just my personality. I'm high
Mm,
risk, so I found that if I'm going to be high risk, I have to be able to forgive myself for stupid mistakes.
mm,
But I've got some people that facilitate my material with me, and one of them particularly is a perfectionist, Enneagram 1,
yeah, yeah,
and he has helped me to see that once you start getting into this world, somebody like him, then it just can become another fresh way to beat himself up.
yeah.
And the phrase that we've learned to teach our students is the curse of you should know better by now. What
Mm,
what would you say to someone? They're diving into internal family systems, they're finding some of this helpful, but it's going to
yeah,
take a while, right? Before they,
yeah,
how would you help them have
yeah,
grace for themselves?
yeah. So take the Enneagram One friend of yours. I mean, as as a result of his own story, his upbringing, the wounds of his life, um, his family of origin, all these kinds of things. He's become perfectionistic and maybe in that pretty self-critical. That's work that we do in internal family systems, right? His inner critic or his perfectionist is going to be a lot more dominant in his internal system than yours might be.
Yeah.
You probably have a little bit of a perfectionist inside you or an inner critic, but it's just not as loud. And so I'm forgetting your original question, but I guess real quickly, it's about then doing the work of paying attention to the role that perfectionistic part plays. And what I find really fun about this work is each one of these parts holds a different element of your story. And so when we begin to interact with that perfectionistic part, that perfectionistic part has a story to tell. And maybe that story is about how critical mom was when I was a little boy, or how dad said you're a failure at a very significant moment. And so as we begin to learn about these different parts, we can then offer some healing or transformation of the parts.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's good. And actually, even as you're speaking, I'm thinking, one of the reasons I'm quick to forgive myself is so that someone else can't condemn me. I can kind of
Yeah.
manage it myself and get it over with, so to
Yeah.
speak. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Uh, so I think heavily related to this, right? You wrote this book, Wholeheartedness.
Right.
I'm just looking, busyness, exhaustion, and healing the divided self. I mean,
Right.
the subtitle alone has to
Right.
make people want to buy it.
I hope
Um,
so.
nice. The thing that I found intriguing about it, Chuck, is you said more downtime and more rest is not automatically the answer.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear about that.
Yeah, well, yeah, I think there's this myth that we can somehow control it, figure it out, find that perfect work life balance, right? And that often has to do with, well, to get back to internal family systems, that may just be a part of us that thinks it can achieve rest,
Good.
um, and and I think that as I've interacted with people on this, uh, what you kind of get is kind of a common example that I like to talk about is the guy that works really hard throughout the week, and then he's at that TGIF moment, and he works hard, and now he's going to like rest hard, and so he drinks 6 beers on the couch on a Saturday afternoon watching football, and another 8 beers on Sunday watching some more football, and he wonders why he's not rested, going back to work on a Monday morning. Um, I think rest is sort of maybe a little bit more elusive than that, And when we talk about wholeheartedness, we're talking about a much more integrated life, so much so that we're engaging in practices that allow us to live from a place of integration, to live from center, even in the midst of our work. And so there isn't like rest time and work time, but it's something far more integrated, I guess.
Okay, more of a constant rhythm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's right. And so we engage in practices that allow us to live from our center. I think that's it. When I talk about wholeheartedness, I want us to live from our center.
Yeah.
I often define it as a place of oneness and worthiness in Jesus, right? Like live from a very centered place, so that when I'm done with this conversation with you, I'm not like, wow, that was exhausting. I need a nap now. But that I'm coming from a place of wholeness, even in a conversation like this.
Yeah, you actually write about, if I recall, we all at the same time hide and are hidden in Christ.
Yeah. Yeah. I like to talk about it as another way of saying it is we all live in two dances, the dance of intimacy and the dance of hiddenness. And intimacy is what we're made for. We're made for relationship, for vulnerability, for connection. And yet, those managers, those protectors that we were just talking about, they say, it's too scary, it's too risky, hide, protect yourself, danger, danger, danger. And I think if we're aware of that, and if we live life from a place of awareness, from our center, from a place of what I call wholeheartedness, we're just more apt. I'm more apt to walk out my door after this conversation is over, not into a firestorm, not into a world that just feels scary and risky, but with a new sense of maybe presence and confidence that even if a hard thing happens, even if my dean calls me in and says, Chuck, I need to have a conversation, it's okay, because I'm held in a deep place by God. So that's that idea of being hidden in Christ. I'm in union with God, so I'm held in a way that allows me to navigate all the different contingencies of life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you talk about people who want to flee Egypt for the promised land.
Mm-hmm.
They don't want to walk through the wilderness. They want to take a plane flight over the
Yeah,
wilderness.
right. That's right.
So for
Yeah.
people who, I don't know, for people who are not experienced at sitting in pain, what are a couple of tools that you offer to hike through the wilderness rather than get on that plane?
Yeah. Well, I love that metaphor because it's it's the Exodus story, right? And we're all on this journey of life, and we all want to avoid suffering. But I think there is this invitation to walk with Jesus through the wilderness of our lives, through the suffering of our lives, to see it as important and vital for our own healing. I don't think that means, though, diving headlong into the furnace, into the hardest things. I do think that the gift of internal family systems for me has been recognizing that I simply need to sort of be aware of the emotion of the moment, and there are inner resources to allow me to, in the midst of that loneliness I was experiencing on Monday, from that place of true self where God is most present, for God to show up, for Jesus to show up in a way that allows me to hold the lonely parts of me, and so
Yeah.
so it's almost like, and this may be confusing for people who are not familiar with this system, but it's really an invitation for God to be far more present to you in the midst of your pain than maybe you've ever experienced God before. And so God's holding you in the midst of your loneliness or your anxiety or your shame. And that allows you to sort of sit with the pain, but it doesn't overwhelm you, if that makes sense. So
It also sounds like, if I'm hearing you right, that then also gives you the opportunity to receive a more deep experience of God's grace than ever before.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. But it's not I think I grew up in a very intellectual and cognitive tradition of the faith where all of this was theology, but it wasn't really translated into an inner experience, and when you recognize, St. Augustine once said, God is more near to me than I am to myself. And this reality that God is dwelling within me by the Spirit and is so hospitable to every part of me, is not at all scared of my anger, even my rage, is not at all scared of that loneliness that I was feeling on Monday, but delights to be present to every part of me. That's a very different way of living. And it's not just an intellectual reminder, it's a real sense of I'm not alone right now. God is holding my loneliness.
I knew, Chuck, when I was going to interview you that there'd be more topics than time. Before I run you through my gauntlet of questions for every guest, I do just want to touch on narcissism. You've been blogging lately on narcissism, and unfortunately, in my line of work, I'm a pastor, there's something about the pulpit and the modern church and the way that we run the modern church that I think either creates or fuels narcissists, or at least maybe a fairer way to say it is narcissistic tendencies.
Right.
What would you like to just say to any leader, particularly church leaders, about narcissism?
Yeah, this has been a harder book to write just because the topic is a painful one, and we're recognizing, there's a surprising lack of work and study and research done on this in pastors. A recent Canadian study says that pastors are diagnosed at 400 to 500% higher rates of the personality disorder, not just the spectrum, but narcissistic personality disorder more than the average population. And, a part of it is like, who would want to speak on behalf of God, with that kind of authority, as a pastor, I say, this is the word of the Lord, right? And so there is a sense in which in our world, we are on stage speaking on behalf of God. And, there are a relative few that want to do that. And I think we can do that from a deeply humble place. But I think that there are some who are drawn to the stage, and you see higher rates of narcissism, of course, among politicians and lawyers and actors, but sadly you see it among pastors as well. And I think in part because we are speaking with great authority in front of people, and it takes a certain kind of person to do that. So
yeah, and surely one of the challenges of narcissism is it's typically the symptom, or maybe symptom's not the right word, but complete lack of self-awareness is one of the issues. So how does a pastor pay attention to that?
That's exactly it. And that's the hard thing. When I do psychological testing with pastors, and they show up on the narcissistic spectrum or narcissistic personality disorder, that's the first thing I'm looking for is how do they respond? Are they aware enough to say, oh, wow, so is there curiosity?
Okay.
Tell me more about that, Chuck. Or that's disturbing to hear. What can I do? That's what I want to look for. And so what I invite pastors to is curiosity. Are you willing to ask the question of another, how do you experience me? And hear what they say, really hear what they say, even if it's hard. I experience you as arrogant at times, or you lack empathy in our conversations. Are you willing to lean into that kind of hard conversation?
Okay, that's so helpful. So I just recently interviewed a good friend of mine, Jay Pathak. He's a pastor in town. He's got a lot of family systems work under his belt. And 3 times a year, his key staff get in a room, big whiteboard. Jay always goes first, and 2 questions. What is my best contribution to this team? Not what am I good at, what are my skills, but just how do I show up? And then what do you all want me to know about my negative impact? And they all go around and share together. And that's a great tool.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that. That's so courageous.
Yes. Yeah. And of course, Jay goes first, as the lead pastor, and everyone speaks frankly to him and they go around.
Wow.
It's fantastic.
We need more of that.
Yes, we do. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, Chuck. So I ask my guests, same set of questions. I just find it helpful for our listeners. And some of I'm adjusting on the fly because some of the questions you just naturally addressed.
Oh, good.
In the way you showed up. But we've found it helpful for people who are getting a start on this material to learn to pay attention to anxiety. What we've noticed in some of our listeners already is they wouldn't call it anxiety. They would call it energy or something else.
Sure.
So one of the questions we ask all our guests is, where does anxiety start for you physiologically? Is it a racing mind, a spinning heart? Sorry, I always get this wrong. I've been asking this question for weeks now. Is it a spinning mind? Is it a racing heart? Or is it a tightening gut? And oftentimes it shows up in all three, but does it begin in one place for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. My initial sense of that, as I pay attention to my body, is that it's in this part of me, right?
In the chest.
I feel it in my throat, my chest, right? That's kind of where I feel it the most. The beating heart, sort of the racing heart. And as you said, I can have some, gut feelings around that, and I can have the racing thoughts. But when I start to feel anxiety, it's all in here first.
Upper chest. Okay, great. Okay. And then would you be willing to share a recent mistake you've made and how you recovered from it?
Oh, great question. Yeah. I can choose from a lot.
Sure. Great.
Yeah. So I think related to anxiety, I'll talk about my relationship with my high school daughter for just a moment. She'll probably never listen to this, but she was having a really hard morning, and she's in her senior year. And at times she has a kind of immobilizing anxiety where she just can't get going, and she's overwhelmed. And in the midst of that, I think that I can be, come on, let's go. You need to get going. You need to get to school. We need to get out of the door on time. Your sister needs a ride to school, and I'll push, right? And I think that what I recognize shortly after that, after things de-escalate a little bit, is that I'm just scared. And I told my daughter that as we sat down and kind of processed that situation, that I just felt really anxious that morning. There's a part of me that fears that this immobilization is something that is more than situational, and that it's gonna plague her. I worry about her going away to college and not having my wife Sarah and I around to hold her in the midst of her anxiety. And it just really helped her to hear that her dad was scared and not mad at her. But it felt like to her, like I was mad at her at first, right? Yeah. When I was kind of trying to push her to get going, and almost like, what's wrong with you? Come on, let's go. Yeah. So,
and for you to offer a gift to your daughter of reframing what your anxiety showed up as anger, and for you to reframe it back to her as fear, that's an incredible gift.
Yeah.
We've spent most of our time, because of your specialty, in internal anxiety.
Yeah.
But you also are a leader. You've done pastoral work. You're an academic leader. Let's talk about group anxiety. Where's a situation in your life where you have seen anxiety be contagious, where people catch anxiety the way you catch a cold?
Oh, so many examples. So I've been I've served in churches and organizations in Orlando and in San Francisco and here, and I'm always now I'm in a seminary setting here. I'm always aware of anxiety in systems, right? There's a kind of institutional anxiety that's unique to each and every system. And I'm sorry, just ask the question one more time so that I know what to hone in on.
No, this is great. Yeah. What's a situation where you've seen anxiety be contagious, where people catch it the way you catch a cold?
Yeah. I think this is okay to talk about, because I think it's a public conversation to some degree. We're in the midst of a leadership transition at the seminary that we're in right now. And so our longtime president, who has been a great leader and has raised millions and millions of dollars for the seminary, is retiring. And so there is anxiety in the system. And, there are a bunch of Christian academics around here who are not used to talking about emotions, that quickly. And so I think sometimes I can overfunction in systems like this and try to manage the anxiety, or, in my best days, try to be the non-anxious presence. But I've noticed that within the last year or so, in part because of this transition, in part because of other organizational, institutional kinds of things, in group conversations or faculty meetings, staff meetings, people are just a little bit more testy, a little bit more anxious, a little bit more maybe a little angry at times, or a little distant at other times. And I think I think that's pretty normal. This is what happens in leadership transitions. But it's as you say, people are sort of catching it. People are feeling it, and then they're triangulating and kind of sharing it in small groups with others and talking about it. What are we going to do? What's going to happen? Who are they going to pick? Is it going to be the right kind of leader for us? How this thing, and now we're talking in smaller groups. And do you think they're feeling this, or what kind of leader do you think they want? I want this kind of leader. They want that kind of leader. And so it just catches.
Fantastic. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. We have two more questions.
Sure.
This one's the most personal. It's also my favorite. When in your life do you feel most fully loved?
Great question. I think I feel it. I practice contemplative prayer, and that has become a really important practice over the last 20 years or so. And I practiced it in fits and starts. So it's not like I'm some sort of, Zen contemplative that can sit for hours and hours. I think I really struggle because I've got a very anxious inner life. And so I often say that in a 20-minute contemplative prayer session, my first 18 and a half minutes are frenzied, and then maybe I settle down for a minute and a half. But I think it's in that space. I mean, you might be able to see it on the wall, is where we can see each other right now, but I've got Rembrandt's Return of the Prodigal Son.
Yes, you do.
Yeah, and that's become a really important image for me. And I think in contemplative prayer, and the stillness and silence of contemplative prayer, if I can relax and surrender in that space, I describe it as we're able to just sort of fall into God's goodness. We're able to fall into God's arms. I relax all of these anxious, controlling parts of me, and I'm able to just sort of relax into love. And I love that line from the hymn, "Ocean Depths of God's Love," because it's like you're falling into the ocean of God's love, and you're held in a way that I don't care how great your marriage is, you're held in a way, far more deeply by God than you are by any human being, And so Sarah and I will be married 25 years this year, and I experienced deep connection to Sarah. But I think there is this infinitely available connection in God that I think if we over-intellectualize the faith, we don't experience, And so contemplative prayer has been that space for me.
Well, thank you for that answer. And
Yeah.
I am also, since you pointed out that we're on Zoom here, I'm going to also point out to our listeners, Chuck is in his office. He has Rembrandt's Return of the Prodigal Son, what looks like a fairly large frame on his wall. Yeah. What I love about Chuck's answer right now with contemplative prayer is he also has drop ceiling and fluorescent lights. You don't actually need to go to the mountaintop or a monastery. You're describing those experiences right there in your office.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think my friend just went on a pilgrimage. He walked the entire Camino. And I do think this is not the case of my friend, but I do think that sometimes we think that we have to go somewhere special to experience this, right? And that's where that line from Augustine has been so important. God is more near to me than I am to myself,
That's good. Yeah. And for the record, if I had a choice, I would prefer to connect with God in a CC than in fluorescent office, but still, you can do it either place.
Hey, notice I don't have the fluorescent lights on. They never go on.
Played.
Well played.
Yeah, okay.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, great. The last question is, what activities or places make you feel most fully human and alive? What do you do for fun?
Yeah.
Where do you go for fun?
Yeah, that's great. I think my family is just being with my family when we're together and we're connecting in ways, whether we're playing games or having a serious conversation. That's where I feel deep connection and aliveness in my soul. And so, the core of this is going to be relationship. When I'm connected to other people in a meaningful kind of way, I feel really alive. And so that can be around an activity. I'm a reader. You see all the books in my office right now, and I love contemplative spirituality. And I always say my favorite 16th century reformer is Saint Teresa of Avila. When people talk about John Calvin and Martin Luther, Saint Teresa is my favorite. I love a sort of a deep drinker of the mystics, and we love to travel. We love to go to. So Sarah and I, our girls are old enough now for us to have a lot of time together. So first of all, we just love on the weekends to go and find new restaurants and eat out. We love good food. We feel great delight with a great meal and a great conversation. But then we love to plan trips, and we're trying to plan a trip this summer to maybe Switzerland if we can afford it, right? And that's just so much fun for us as a family to get away. And I realize those years are, my oldest is going to go away to college, so those years are kind of behind us now more and more. But we'll take the last few trips together as a family, I guess, in these next couple of years. So,
for more resources and show notes from today's episode, go to managingleadershipanxiety.com or stevecusswords.com. They'll both take you to the same place.
This episode has been a production of Brendan Reed and Steve Cuss.